Michigan community rallied to identify woman who threw hot coffee at McDonald's employee.
She said properly and apologize to somebody for being here over an hour. That's what you can have.
Yeah, within 20 minutes later.
Nah, catch that hot ass.
The customer reportedly placed an online order and claimed she'd waited over an hour for sandwiches, but it turned out those sandwiches were canceled because the breakfast items were not available after 11 a.m.
If any order pulled up after 10:15, it's automatically canceled. Okay,
And it did not cancel. It's showing that the order was already made. Watch this. Ma'am. It said you did not cancel.
Ma'am, when we pull it up, if it's after 10:15, the food automatically
I was already
canceled.
here, so it
It
didn't
doesn't.
cancel.
Yes,
Why is
it
the
does.
order in the order? It just canceled right now.
While the manager was trying to explain the woman she'd receive her refund in 48 hours, she just took her anger out.
So guys, I want to do a couple of black fatigue videos. And there is this video about this woman in Michigan who received bad customer service at McDonald's. And I will talk about that in a minute. But what happened is that she ordered something online, and what happens is that they change the menu. So sometimes what happens is that, let's say your breakfast sandwiches are available online, or you do like an Uber Eats order. And what happens is that sometimes you may have breakfast items, and you purchase breakfast items, and then when you go to the place, they say, oh, well, or when you pick up, or when you get the Uber Eats to pick it up, they'll be like, oh, well, we can't make it for you because, there's a certain time around 10:30 and 3 a.m. for people who work the night shift. When McDonald's orders do change from because what they do is they serve breakfast from like 3 a.m. all the way to 10:30 a.m. And then 10:30 a.m. all the way to 3 a.m. That's when they serve the dinner, the lunch and dinner items. So in response to that, she got mad. She said fuck you, enjoy this hot ass water. So I want to talk about a couple of things. That first of all, I do not condone this whatsoever. And I do want to talk a little bit about McDonald's. That, I've done Uber Eats with them many times, especially during the night shift because I work at a hospital. So, one bad thing that they do at McDonald's is if you place an order at 2 a.m. or 2:30 and it's hard to find an Uber Eats driver. What happens is that if they arrive to the McDonald's at 3 a.m., they're not going to make you burgers. They're going to be they're going to call you and be like, oh, well, you got to order something else or whatever, really. So instead of a Big Mac or double quarter pound of cheese, you end up with an egg sandwich or something like that. Or, sometimes there's people who are I want a burger, not pancakes or something like that. So sometimes it does get frustrating. I do understand that. And then there's some people who like the breakfast menu, the same exact thing. They may be going into work, they may have a break, then they have an Uber Eats order that arrives late and they say, no, you gotta have dinner, you gotta have a lunch item. So, part of that is that I think that when they do online orders with Uber Eats and other platforms, 100%, they really, really have to say, okay, a half an hour before 10:30, 10 a.m., and a half an hour before 3 a.m., 2:30 a.m., there needs to be a stoppage of those items, so that way people don't deal with, food coming in late. Orders coming to the store late and then they get canceled because, it inconveniences a lot of people, and sometimes when we go to restaurants, one turn off from a restaurant is that they don't have a particular item. I've been to different restaurants where that happened. I've been to McDonald's where stuff like that's happened. And it is really frustrating, but I do not condone this behavior. I think that I remember many times I've gone to restaurants and I've received bad customer service, but I'm not responding to violence. I remember when I went to, I'll give you a few examples. I went to Ricky's on 5 in Wallingford, Connecticut, and I remember that I was just, I stayed up all night. I was a little emotional, and I was just ordering, a lot of food and wanted to be made a certain way. They made my order wrong. And then the next thing was that I ordered a banana sundae. And when I walked away, the waitress called me special, a slang term for a retard. And, I could have punched her in the face, or I could have said, you know what, you don't call me that, what the hell's wrong with you? I could have just act like a thug, really. But I didn't do that, and I had no desire to do that. But it was disrespectful. I did not leave her a tip because of that. And the reason why I did not leave her a tip was because that's a bad term. That's like if somebody said, okay, well, queer, or someone called somebody a queer, or someone called somebody, like slow or whatever. Really, it was not right for them to say that. Or they could have said something like, what, you're not being respectful by asking for too much, or you're being a little loud or whatever. I think you need to just take a breath or whatever. Really, there's best ways to kind of share that I wasn't being respectful that day, but you don't call somebody slow. Or I remember when I went to Geronimo's in New Haven, Connecticut, that I received bad customer service. I remember like one time they made my food, and then they closed me out because I asked to be closed down. Then I wanted to order something else, and they started shouting at me. I remember one time, I wasn't always on top of tipping. So I remember them leaving a bunch of $5 tips, and then what happened was there was someone that had a bad day, so I had extra money, so I bought her a meal, and then I still tipped the waiter like $5, and then he kind of was saying, you're supposed to tip me like 20% and other things like that. And then there was a time too where I would be working 16, 17 hours, and I was legitimately not falling asleep at the table. And he said, I didn't take your order because you were like and sleeping, whatever. And he's like, you can't do that, whatever. So what I did was that I got my revenge. And then he was kind of like, loud one time about tipping and whatever, really. Like he expected me, if I ordered like $70 worth of food, he was expecting maybe a $30, $40 tip, really. But there were times I wanted to drag this guy over the counter and beat his ass, really, because, hey, you know what? First of all, I hate it when people say Byron is sleeping. I know when I'm awake and not awake, because I remember like one time in high school, I was dozing off at the dinner table, and my dad forced me to go to bed at 7 at night, really. And I had a little brother who went to bed at 9 p.m. So you're telling a grown man in high school, an 18-year-old, to go to bed at 6 p.m., but you're telling a fucking wild-ass kid who, my younger brother, who was a little bit of a spoiled brat, really, he can go to bed at like 9 or 10 a.m., and part of that was just because my dad liked bossing me around, really. Senior year in high school, and it's my last chance to just boss you around and have an ego trip, really. So it always reminds me of that, really. But also too, it was a sign of disrespect. It was a sign of, I can openly disrespect you. And I've been in a lot of situations in my life where I've been bullied and disrespected, really. So there's times where I've thought about putting hands on people, but I choose not to for two reasons. Number one, I grew up with a bunch of domestic violence, and people just like, I have a great day, but then my dad's like, F this, F that. I'm going to throw this thing around the house. I'm going to throw this around the house, whatever, really. So I don't like going to restaurants, and I don't like being that a-hole that's like, okay, I got to just ruin everybody's day, really. Because you know what? If I was ever if I was an actor in a movie and it was my job to kind of be the jerk character, I would just, knock it out of the park, really. Because I grew up with like jerk behavior, really. But there's been times in my life where I've wanted to, act like a thug or a hood nigga, or just very retaliatory towards people who, towards bad customer service. But I chose not to because I have sense, really. It's not, just because you're frustrated does not give you the right to assault food staff, food workers, and food employees. And again, because I have a good father, my father washed dishes, and he always told me a story that he respects food workers because he used to, work until 3 or 4 a.m., in the 70s, washing dishes. Or, I worked in my school cafeteria. I worked with the guy with PTSD, and he would always flip out. Or whenever we made food or we worked hard to make really good food, people would call it like swag, and that's a slang term for shitty food. And people would throw away food. Or one time I remember, the school, the president of our college said something like, okay, we can do more if we get more donations, we can have better food instead of this crap. And, she's trying to make a joke that the food sucks, really. And it really offended a lot of the cafeteria words, and they called her like, they called her a cunt and whatever, type of thing, really. But I've been on both sides. I know what it's like to receive bad customer service, and I know what it's like to receive disrespect in return, really. But both don't warrant, assault or trying to get even with people. We need to respect everybody. And food service people, they don't get paid that well, number one. Number two is that it's a very stressful job because you have to make orders, you have to get things right. There are people who are very entitled, and there are people that don't get it. It's a lot of hard work, really. But there's also another thing too, and I want to talk about the other side. Yes, I did use ChatGPT, and it said that throwing hot water on somebody is assault. And when she said the line "fuck you, enjoy that hot ass coffee," it was that's technically assault. And I think what they said is they don't do battery charges in Michigan, but technically it is assault. And there's no excuse for that. As I said, I can understand people being angry and frustrated, but there's no excuse for that. And then the other thing too is that when I watched the video, the manager was being polite and understanding. And I also understand the woman was very upset because, they need to have better policies with when they have to do cutoffs to prevent situations like this from happening at McDonald's. So I blame McDonald's for making a situation that frustrates people. But in general, the hot coffee on this woman was not appropriate. Thankfully, I've heard reports that thankfully she did not, have any bodily injuries. If she did, take some pictures. But also too, the other thing that I want to say is, even if no bodily injuries, there has to be assault charges, because there's a couple of things. That number one, there's an issue with women, and the thing is that I remember watching this video of a woman using pepper spray on a guy. And the judge said something like, you can do two options. You can, the guy you assaulted, he has two choices. He can say 30 days in jail, or he can spray you with pepper spray. And what he did was spray her with pepper spray, but it was filled with water. So sometimes we run into that sexist culture that if a woman commits an assault on a woman, a man, or a child, really, or an African American, because there's also that racial thing of, if a white woman assaults a black man, it's not seen as a big deal, really. There's always this thing too where women are kind of protected a little bit, but if this was a black man assaulting a white woman, if this was a man assaulting a woman, there's gonna be more charges, really. But usually when it's woman on woman, it's not really a big deal. But it is a little different because, from how this person talks, it's like a ghetto-ass poor black woman and a white woman. So we all kind of know that, with how racism is in this country, more than likely she's going to be thrown under the bus, really. She's going to be thrown under the bus, especially with this black fatigue movement going as well, really. So I think that's another big issue in this country is that, men and women are not punished equally. We should all be treated equally. But as I said, I think this was a white woman doing this to another white woman. Probably should get community service, because she's black and she's kind of like a ghetto. She has kind of that ghetto vibe about her. More than likely she's gonna, catch some serious charges for this. The other thing I want to say is that I'm really proud of the person recording this, because sometimes when people start to get hostile and upset, really, it's okay to pull out that camera, because we need to, because it creates justice, really. It really creates justice, because we need to start holding people accountable for their actions, because there's been times where I work at a hospital, really. Like, you're not supposed to have cameras, but sometimes, people don't know that, and there may be some patients, families of patients bringing cameras into the hospital, and there's something crazy going on, they film it. And that is helpful. And if it's not allowed in an environment, don't do it, follow the rules. But in general, you should always bring your camera out, because when people start to mess up and assault people, commit crimes and whatever, we need to hold those people accountable, because we need to hold those people accountable, because this can't go, and that's not just to record black people acting out, that's recording everybody acting out, because it does justice for this woman who got assaulted, because now people see it, and people see the dialogue, people see everything, really, and that's necessary, because and that's necessary because it helps show how malicious this was, really. And then the other thing I want to talk about is the black side, the black fatigue side, that there's something called BET. That's a term I invented. It's called Black Experience Trauma. there's a lot of white experience trauma as well. Like, for example, like if a white person calls a black person, the N word, you know, that's white experience trauma. If back in the 50s, 60s, when people would vandalize black homes or threaten black people, white experience trauma. And that still exists nowadays. And I've been through that too. But there's also BET, black experience trauma, that maybe there are some people that are like, okay, they feel uncomfortable on black people because they have bad experiences around them. So obviously when you do something like this, maybe in the future, people will be more hostile to black customers. So sometimes what a lot of people don't realize is that what you do impacts other people. Like imagine, for example, like I think it was like a year or two ago, they had issues of teenagers taking over McDonald's or people going crazy at McDonald's. And a lot of times that the people who would do it, if you look at the videos, a lot of them were like black and brown skinned teenagers. It could be black, it could be Latinos, it could be whatever really. So each time you do something like this, it makes other black people look bad, because we all know that saying, like there's a bunch of white school shooters, but nobody fears white children. But if those school shooters were all black, people would be fearing black people a lot more really. That's part of the unfortunate level of racism we have in our country. When a black person misbehaves, unfortunately, it's a representative of the whole race, really. And then again, there's reasons why, there's people like me who don't date black women or don't want to have kids with black women or wants to be single, because we just are like, okay, when we see stuff like this, we're like, oh, well, I don't want, just to have some ghetto gangbanger gangsta attitude or whatever, really. It makes me kind of embarrassed to have black skin, because as I said, if I go to McDonald's, I may get some eyes from the people at the store, and maybe like, hell, well, maybe we saw what happened in Michigan, maybe that's you, so it makes everybody look bad. It makes people say, I just don't want to give black women a chance, really, because unfortunately, that's some of the things that happen when things like this happens. You got to just have a lot more class, really, in a sense, really. But I want to say this, that I work at a hospital. If you are racist against black women, work at a hospital, because there's a lot of black women there that are nurses, doctors, they're educated. So, this is not really supposed to be anti-black women, but it's supposed to say that this bad behavior perpetuates the stereotype. This bad behavior creates more racism. So sometimes you need to understand how your actions just cause bigger problems, really, especially with social media. There's a lot of people who comment on the video and they say things like, oh, this is the usual suspects. This is why we have, this is why in Ohio and other places they're starting to have whites only towns, because they're like, oh, we want to get away from the black ghetto ass behavior, really, when that's not the answer. The answer is that people need to be held accountable for their actions. And then ultimately, too, when black people do right and well, really, we need to have those news stories. We need to talk about that on social media and say, hey, you know what? That's just a small group, really, because really what happens nowadays is when a black person misbehaves on social media, people are willing to say things like, okay, we need to bring back lynchings because it's gonna teach them fear, or maybe we need to bring back police brutality to kind of put them back in their place. There's too much entitlement. Or we need to say things like, okay, don't date black women. We got to let, we can't just have, because they bring the gangster into a black child, really. It creates a lot of these racist ideologies, and that's not the point, really. The point of it is that that we do live in an entitlement culture, but that's everybody in America. That's all races. Yeah, number one. Number two is that we do live in a culture where if women do things like this, they're not willing. They don't get charged as much. And then the other thing too is that McDonald's is a multi-billion-dollar company. Where is your security? What about the security about this? And then also too, they put their employees in bad situations. They don't have security. And then the next thing about McDonald's is that, like I said about their policies, that they receive orders all day. But there are certain times when they change orders, and when they change orders, your order will get canceled, because they'll say, "Hey, we don't have burgers available. Order off the breakfast menu," or "Hey, we don't have your breakfast food. Order a burger," or "We're going to cancel your order in general because we're just too busy." And like I've said before, that there are situations like this where this woman, this person who was in the store, this employee was being respectful to this woman, and didn't deserve this, But then there's times where there are people who work at bars and other places, like I've shared, where people just think it's okay to be disrespectful, really. It's not right, really. We all need to treat people with respect. And there's been many times where I've gone to restaurants and I've been very respectful, and then there's times when I've been, not respectful, and I paid the consequence for my behavior, really. So, there's things I need to work on. I'm not perfect, really, but ultimately, too, as we all understand, that it's a black fatigue video because, again, this goes down to the ghetto and the gangster and the short temper and the entitlement, and then also the culture that we have in the black community that we have to address. And then also, too, it kind of goes down to that other thing, too, of, okay, if this was a black man doing this to a white woman, we know how it goes down. If this is a black woman doing it to a white woman, maybe not as much charges, because we all know that when it's woman-on-woman violence, it's not seen as big, but man-on-man violence is seen as man-on-woman violence is seen as a big thing, really, So, very unfortunate video and very pathetic, very, very pathetic. There's things that we all want. There's service that we all want. There's expectations that we have when we order food, and we should not be jerks to others.